So it's February 10th, 2019. Welcome to Potkaars, which in Dutch is pot with candle. And I'm lighting one at the beginning of every show. There you go. And that's my guest, Mr. Alfred de Zayas from Geneva. Welcome.
Welcome.
So, how to introduce you? I came up with, you're the former rapporteur for the United Nations. You were born in Cuba, grew up in the United States, and you're currently professor of international law at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. Expert in the field of human rights and international law. Do I need to continue, or have I...
And a retired senior lawyer for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, used to be the secretary of the UN Human Rights Committee, and also the chief of the petitions department. That's more or less like registrar. So all complaints to the Human Rights Committee, Committee Against Torture, Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, went over my desk.
All right. So thanks for being here in Holland, in Almere. That's where you are, in the middle of Holland. I've invited you here to talk about situation in Venezuela and Spain, Catalonia, with the emphasis on Venezuela for this conversation. And I've looked into your reports on that, which date back to at least 2014, where you said the
2014, I have a report on self-determination,
exactly,
which applies both to Catalonia and to Venezuela. Obviously, every people has the right to determine the form of government it wants. And it's, shall we say, a far more crucial article of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights than, say, the Article 25, which is the article that provides for regular periodic elections. But what is really at the crux of the matter is the right that you have a right to decide your own future. Every people has that right. My colleague, professor of international law here at the University of Geneva, Nicolas Levrat, wrote this important book last year, 2017, on the right of the Catalans to decide their future.
Yeah, so I feel, and maybe we'll get to that in this conversation, that the situation in Venezuela and the situation in Spain with Catalonia are not all that different.
Oh, they are related. But what shocks me in the case of Venezuela is not that a demented president wants to arrogate upon himself the right to determine, I want this person as president of Venezuela and I want this person as whatever, but the fact that the Dutch, the French, the Spaniards, the Canadians have followed suit. So you have here actually a revolt against international law carried out not by banana republics, but is carried out by countries that claim to be committed to democracy, rule of law, and human rights. That is serious, but it's, of course, it's not the first time that it happens. We saw it happen in 2003 when George W. Bush, without any justification of whatever, and accompanied by an ocean of lies and fake news, not only attacked, demolished, devastated Iraq, but dragged with him the so-called coalition of the willing. So you had 43 states in a conspiracy against international law and against the United Nations Charter. And as far as Venezuela is concerned, it's obvious that Articles 1 and 2 of the United Nations Charter affirm the sovereign equality of states, affirm that there is a positive obligation to negotiate peacefully whatever differences may exist between states. And then there is an absolute prohibition on the use of force and even on the threat of the use of force. And there's another prohibition concerning the interference in the internal affairs of states. The principle of non-interference, the principle of non-intervention is something that belongs to customary international law, not only UN Charter law, and something that is being violated really brazenly. I mean, I'm amazed at the chutzpah of what's going on and at the fact that you have a so-called Grupo de Lima that has recognized this self-appointed interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, who does not have any legitimacy, zero legitimacy. Read Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution. You will realize, I mean, a first-year law student would see that Article 233 does not apply. On the other hand, they invent this fake law. They refer to this article that doesn't apply. Everybody repeats it. The media carries it. So the narrative is that the guy has some sort of legitimacy. He doesn't.
All right, so just thank you for that. And let me walk by the points that you made. First off, you went into the war in Iraq by Bush. And the rationale at that time was weapons of mass destruction. So we know now for a fact that they were not there and that legitimacy was not there. So
everybody knew before the attack. You had...
Yeah, fair enough. But and
you had El Baradei, the Security Council inspectors on the ground, and they made several reports saying there's nothing here. Although there were under enormous pressure from Washington to use those magic words, material breach of Security Council resolutions that would have allowed perhaps the use of force. Yeah.
So for me, as just a citizen in Holland and an observer from the television and CNN back in those days of that conflict, I was under the assumption that there might be some legitimacy to that claim that there were weapons of mass destruction. So that rationale worked for me at that time. Now,
exactly. I mean, the idea is to make it palatable to world public opinion that this is not sheer aggression, you know. This is not the crime against peace of Hitler invading Poland. No, no, no. Yeah. This has some sort of goodness to it.
Exactly.
I
now,
mean,
hang on. Where
Machiavellism of it. The cynicism of it is breathtaking.
Where I want to go is that I have learned, and the world has learned since then, that rationale of weapons of mass destruction was fake. Now, my question to you is: have we indeed learned as a world population, and do we now have a higher standard, if you will, of the arguments? Because you referred to Article 233. I'm not a law student, but I did look it up. And Article 233 of the Constitution of Venezuela says, when the president-elect is absolutely absent before taking office, a new election shall take place, and until the new president is elected and takes office, the interim president should be president. So the point that they make in the United States is that if Maduro either dies or is in a coma or whatever, the vice president...
Vice president.
Exactly.
Not the National Assembly.
So the
National Assembly comes later.
After that, yeah. So if there's no vice president either...
It's just bad faith. They're lying to you brazenly. As I said, it's chutzpah. Yeah. I mean, you do it, and it's like you put out your flag and see if anybody salutes.
Yeah.
And it's a trial balloon, but they have succeeded with the collusion of the New York Times, of the Washington Post, of the Economist, of the Financial Times, of CNN, of Fox, of the BBC. The BBC has ceased long ago to be a real source of news. Yeah. I mean, it's a source of fake news. It's a source of manipulation. It's a source of partial news, because if someone gives you 50% of the news, they're actually lying to you because they are withholding the other 50%. Yeah. So in any event, there is collusion on the part of the mainstream media to lie to the public, to make it palatable that a military intervention by the United States might be somehow legitimate, if not even legal.
Yeah. And Guaido actually called for that or referred to that just the other day, saying, well, I might ask them to intervene. Right?
Exactly. If you muddle the waters, as the United States has done, and people have the impression that maybe the guy has some sort of legitimacy, then his request to the United States or some other country for military assistance could be legitimate. Yeah. Obviously, the only situation in which a foreign state can participate in an internal civil war or in an internal situation of, shall we say, rioting, destabilizing, humanitarian crisis, or whatever, is if that country is asked to come in and is asked by the legitimate authority. The legitimate authority is, without a doubt, Maduro.
Yeah.
But if you create the false impression that the other guy, Guaido, has some sort of legitimacy, then the United States will go ahead and do it. And that danger is there. But what I told when I was in Venezuela, as you know, I was the first UN rapporteur to go to Venezuela in 21 years. I spoke with the National Assembly members, I spoke with opposition members, I spoke with professors, with non-governmental organizations, Amnesty International, Provea, opponents of Maduro. I spoke with journalists, I spoke with the diplomatic corps. And I told them, look, whether you like it or not, there are 7, 8, 9 million Venezuelans who happen to be committed Chavistas. What are you going to do with them? Even if you topple the government of Maduro, these people are not going to roll over. These people are not going to disappear. Are you going to kill them? I mean, they're there. They're Venezuelans. They're your brothers. I mean, if you want to have any legitimacy as a democratic leader, you have to represent them too. And I would say there is in Venezuela today, rather the biggest single block of Venezuelans is, even today, Chavista. The biggest block. I would say a good third of the population, they are committed Chavistas.
Maybe you should explain
that. Of course, you have a divided opposition, and you have also people who basically don't care and never go to vote. But the last election in 20th of May 2018, you had more than 9 million people going to the urns. You had more than 9 million people voting. That is 47% of the population, of which Henri Falcón of the opposition got 21%, Bertucci got 11%, and Maduro got 68%. So 68% or 47% gives him 31% of people who actually went and voted. So that is quite a block. What are you going to do with these people? What you're going to have is a situation of civil war, and we want to avoid that. So if you want to avoid civil war, go to Montevideo, engage in the mediation of the Montevideo mechanism in good faith, and not what the opposition did 2016, 2017, 2018, the former Spanish Prime Minister, José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, he hosted a 2-year negotiation and dialogue between opposition and the government. And on the 6th of February 2018, there was a reasonable compromise on the table. They had agreed on it. Everybody expected that this was it. And Julio Borges was going to sign. He gets a phone call from Colombia. No, firme, don't sign. He didn't sign. So he basically took not only José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, but also the Vatican and the president of the Dominican Republic, and 3 states that had advised the opposition, and 3 states that had advised Maduro, took them all for a ride. So 2 whole years of negotiation for absolutely nothing. In my report to the Human Rights Council, I published the full text of the agreement, and I also published the letter that Jose Luis Rodriguez Zapatero sent to the opposition, asking them, what happened? You were going to sign this. You know, how come you have pulled out at the very, very last minute? This is bad faith.
Yeah. So you were in Venezuela in 2017, and you reported to the United Nations in August of 2018, including the information that you just gave. So what has been the response that you got to your report from both the United Nations, United States, EU?
Basically, silence. When you cannot dismantle a report, when you cannot disprove what a rapporteur is saying, but you don't like the consequences, you don't like the recommendations, you don't like the findings. So what you do is you ignore it like if the report didn't exist. It's remarkable. Before I went to Venezuela, every non-governmental organization, whether it be the International Service of Human Rights or the International Commission of Jurists or Amnesty International or the Human Rights Watch, they're all clamoring for Venezuela finally to let the United Nations in. Now, I asked, like anybody else, for an invitation, and lo and behold, I got it. When I got it from the very same non-governmental organizations, I started getting letters saying, maybe you shouldn't go. Out of solidarity with your colleagues who were not invited, you shouldn't go. You're not the pertinent rapporteur. And I answered them, look, guys, I'm opening the door one thing at a time. Let me do my report. Let me be result-oriented. Let me be constructive rather than confrontational. Once the Venezuelan government realizes that the United Nations is not a priori against them, once they think that we can offer added value, we can offer advisory services and technical assistance, because that's one of the problems with Venezuela. They have too many ideologues and not enough technocrats. And I called in UNHCR, FAO, WHO when I was in Caracas, all the UN agencies. I said, look, guys, help the Venezuelan people. That is the priority. Just help the people. Try to get the sanctions lifted. Try to end this wasteful economic war. Try to end the financial blockade so that Venezuela can buy and sell like anybody else. Because that's a problem. It's not like Venezuela doesn't want to distribute medicine, or it's holding it back, or there's a case of corruption and people are putting their money in their pockets. It's not at all that. The report that I presented to the council documents the fact that the government has been trying to buy anti-malaria medicine, for instance, from Colombia. Colombia says no, so the government has to go and buy it in India. Or the government has been trying to buy 300,000 dosages of insulin, and Citibank blocks the transaction. And 80% of the accounts of Venezuela have been closed. No bank wants to deal with Venezuela for fear of major penalties to be paid to the U.S. Treasury. So you don't want to get anywhere close to breaking the sanctions because the penalties are very severe. So that essentially asphyxiates the country's economy. And this is not unlike what happened in 1970 to 1973. When Allende gets elected, the first thing that Nixon does is calls in Kissinger and says, look, Kissinger, we are not going to tolerate an alternative socioeconomic model taking hold in Latin America. We're going to make the Chilean economy scream. And since 1999, the United States has been trying to make the Venezuelan economy scream, the United States basically is part and parcel of the so-called humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And that's why it is so Machiavellian and it is so cynical and it's so offensive that when the United States creates the problem, then the United States says, look, I'm bringing you humanitarian assistance. We're sending so and so many tons of humanitarian assistance to Colombia, et cetera, et cetera. Look, the solution is a lot easier and cheaper. Lift the sanctions. Let the government sell its oil. Let the government sell its gold and bauxite and coltan and buy what it needs. But if you block $9 billion that Citgo, the American branch of Petróleos de Venezuela in the United States, if you block $9 billion that are owed to the government of Venezuela, then that $9 billion are not available to buy food and medicine. If the United Kingdom refuses to return 31 tons of gold, it's the equivalent of $1.2 billion that are in the Bank of England, that Venezuela needs to feed its people. That is the solution of the problem. But I find this whole business of U.S. aid the same thing as the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the National Endowment for Democracy. These are Trojan horses. I mean, anybody who knows the situation knows that these are Trojan horses, and Maduro doesn't want to let them in.
Well, either Trojan horses or public opinion, playing the public opinion, right?
Sure. But I mean, if the humanitarian aid were to come from Mexico, were to come from Uruguay, were to come from Bolivia, were to come from the Vatican, obviously Venezuela would gladly take it. Yeah. But the person who is trying to asphyxiate you, the person who's trying to strangle you, are you going to accept anything from that person? That person has no credibility. Trump has no credibility. Pompeo has no credibility. Now they've invented this other instance of fake news, this other instance of weapons of mass destruction, variations on a theme, Hezbollah. Pompeo was talking the other day that they were Hezbollah cells in Venezuela. Give me a break. I mean, it is just so ludicrous what he's saying, but he says it notwithstanding, and there will be a certain number of people who believe it. It's rubbish, but some people want to be lied to. Remember, there's always the person who lies and the person who wants to be lied to. So this is a complex situation.
Yeah, and you've given me a whole lot. Let's walk by a few things that you mentioned. First off was the situation in Chile in 1973, long time ago. And basically what you said is when Pinochet got into power, that situation was not that much unlike what's happening.
Not Pinochet in power, Allende.
Yeah, he was
coming into power in 70.
Yeah.
And Pinochet knocking him out in 73.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Allende was democratically elected.
Yeah.
And for 3 years, the United States tried to asphyxiate the government. And when that didn't work, then a bit more muscle was necessary. And of course, our local muscle came from General Augusto Pinochet, who toppled the government. Allende was killed. And then you had 17 years of dictatorship.
Yeah, so I was born around that time, so I didn't. And also in the Netherlands, you would not learn that much of South America history in school. So
yeah, but the United States has toppled so many governments in
that's the point.
Latin America. You have a book.
No, globally, it's also Iraq.
Times journalist, a book by a New York Times journalist called Stephen Kinzer. The book is called Overthrow, and it just covers a whole list, not only in Latin America, in the rest of the world, where the United States has toppled the government, as it did against Mossadegh in Iran back in 1953, as it did in Paraguay, as it did in Grenada, as it did in Panama, as it did in the Dominican Republic. And so what do you want?
Yeah, and to get back to this,
a tradition of intervention in all of these countries if there is a geopolitical interest, and certainly in the case of Venezuela, there is.
Well, so you're giving me a whole lot. I'm not making notes. I'll do this by heart. So that was Chile in the 70s. You mentioned some other examples. We've also talked about Iraq already. So these things went on until under the Bush administration. Then you mentioned Venezuela just recently wanted to get their gold back from the Bank of England. Now, I don't know if my listeners are aware of this, but a lot of countries store some gold abroad, so that's not uncommon. And Venezuela had some gold in the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States and also in England. Now, in 2011, Venezuela retrieved gold from the Federal Reserve Bank in America, and you said they tried to do it now, and they got their gold back. So that was something. But that was not for humanitarian aid. As far as I'm aware, that's because they rather have it in their own safe than stored at United States.
Well, I mean, they spend 72% of the national budget on social affairs. They have built and delivered 2.5 million housing units, apartments. I visited several of them. I went to the Urbanización Nelson Mandela, for instance, a series of buildings with school and all sorts of things with them. And these are apartments, so 80 square meters, 100 square meters, depending whether it's a family of 4 or 6. And they also have a program called the CLAP, which is food that is given to needy families. 16 kilos of flour and sugar and olive oil, etc., etc. So they do spend the money in social services. The problem being is that, and that is what is driving this whole coup against Maduro, the 1% in Venezuela wants to control everything. They want to go back to the good old days when the rich were rich and the poor were poor. So the idea is to topple the government, to privatize the oil industry, to privatize everything. It will be a bonanza for the 1%. It will be a bonanza for the transnationals. In the future, then, of course, the profits will flow to the United States and elsewhere and into the pockets of the super rich in Venezuela. And the people, once again, will be poor. What people seem to forget is that in the 1990s, well, Chavez came to power in February 1999. And then he had 14 good years until his death in 2013. In those years, he managed to lift the Venezuelan population out of abject poverty. People seem to forget that. He managed to do away with analphabetism. He had a huge literacy program. He managed to organize free schooling from primary school through university. He enormously improved medical service, et cetera, et cetera. All of that has been completely blacked out, blended out by the mainstream media. They only remind you of the problem that starts in 2013-14 with the dramatic drop in oil prices. If you have a country like Venezuela that depends 95% on the sale of oil, then if they're getting 50% of what they got before, they got a problem. A problem that, of course, can be solved because you can sell futures, you can sell vouchers, you can sell on issue bonds on the oil that is on the ground. They have, as everybody knows, the largest reserves in the world. And of course, that's why the United States wants it. But as the case may be, the United States has made it impossible for Venezuela to borrow. And then the banks don't transfer the money. So it's a concerted effort to asphyxiate the economy. And the amazing thing is that this effort to asphyxiate the economy has been going on now for the last 4 or 5 years. Full-fledged economic war against Maduro. And Maduro has not fallen from power. And at the last election, more than 6 million Venezuelans went and voted again for him.
Yeah, so going back to the 70s of last century, where you mentioned they tried to pressure a regime change in Chile, and when that didn't work, they upped it a little bit. So that's what you're seeing now in Venezuela also, by United States actively supporting Guaido. Now, the question I have...
And asking the military to topple Maduro. Yeah. I mean, I've never seen such brazen interference in which one country, the United States, is trying to make traitors out of the military of another country, saying that, you know, a general in Venezuela should have greater loyalty to the interests of the United States than to the interests of his own people. And he should then support whom we want to support, who is this puppet by the name of Juan Guaido.
So if you look, what you just mentioned is that this whole thing started like 4 or 5 years ago. So that was not under the Trump administration, but under the Obama administration.
Already.
Yeah, already.
Well, always been, I mean, the subversive activities of U.S. aid and of the National Endowment for Democracy. I mean, they have been financing the opposition, and it's public. They've been financing the opposition for 2 decades, essentially. And the United States co-financed the coup that was carried out on the 11th of April 2002 against Chavez. As you know, it lasted 48 hours. It was Pedro Carmona, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, who carried out that coup d'etat. And that was basically on orders from Washington. I mean, Washington wanted to get rid of this model because this model, if it worked, it means that it is possible for a country to give its population free education. It's possible to give its population better health care. It's possible to give its population housing. So if it works there, then how about the United States, where you have abject poverty?
Yeah, you think the rationale goes into that, or is it just blatant, we want to make money out of the resources of another country?
Both.
Yeah. So, but that was under the...
but I think people forget that there was already a coup d'etat in Venezuela directed by Washington, and that it didn't work because the popularity of Chavez was such that the military actually liberated him and brought him back to the presidential palace, whereupon the leader of the putsch, Pedro Carmona, took refuge in the embassy of Colombia. And interestingly enough, thinking of Julian Assange in London, the Colombian embassy gave Pedro Carmona, who evidently had committed a serious criminal offense, not only rebelling against the democratically elected Chavez, and there's no question that Chavez was democratically elected, had a huge following and a huge victory in the polls, but the fact that obviously the putsch cost dozens of lives and left hundreds of people injured. So there is personal criminal liability for what was done.
You also
Chavez could have said, "You are going to rot in the embassy of Colombia. I will not let you leave the country, so you'll have to stay there." Chavez let him leave, let him go. Whereas Assange, who has only helped us know what's going on, helped us know that the United States government has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in Afghanistan and in Iraq and elsewhere, that's his only crime. And he's been held up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for more than 6 years now. So you see the double standards.
When you, we've established a double standard. So let's move on and dig in a little deeper, because you not only went to Venezuela in 2017, but you also went to Ecuador. Now, when Assange sought refuge in the embassy in London, was the Ecuadorian embassy, and all was good in the beginning. So that was just an asylum seeker.
That was the government of Rafael Correa.
So what has changed in Ecuador since then?
Lenín Moreno, who was very close to Rafael Correa, ran on Correa's popularity and on Correa's platform, because the platform on which Lenín Moreno was elected 2 years ago was essentially the same Revolución Ciudadana platform that had brought Correa to power, and that had resulted in enormous advances in the socio-economic situation of the Ecuadorian population. Unfortunately, no sooner was Lenín Moreno elected that he dropped the commitments made democratically. I mean, dropped the program for which he was elected. And essentially, he has been conducting a neocon, neoliberal government, and pulling away one by one from the commitments made at the election. So whereas Assange had been given diplomatic asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and whereas Assange became an Ecuadorian citizen, and he is an Ecuadorian citizen, Ecuador is denying him fundamental human rights, cutting off his use of the internet, not letting visits in the embassy, etc., etc. So essentially, the idea is neutralize WikiLeaks, neutralize this man, essentially keep him in indefinite detention. Now, the working group of the United Nations on arbitrary detention already determined that his condition in the embassy is not only irregular, but it violates Article 9 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They called upon the United Kingdom to let him leave the embassy and leave the country without arresting him. The only reason to arrest Assange in London would be that at the time, for very good reason, he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. So he jumped bail. So it's the jumping of bail for a completely legal and legitimate reason, protected under the Geneva Refugee Convention. Well, the prosecutor in United Kingdom has remained adamant. And of course, if he leaves the embassy, he will be arrested. And then there is an indictment against Assange in the United States. The United States will ask for extradition, and the United Kingdom will extradite him. So it's a corruption of law, what's going on. It's what it's called also lawfare, when you use the machinery of the law for purposes of injustice. Actually, use the machinery of the law to undermine the rule of law.
Now, we started this talk on Venezuela and your report that you published in August of 2018. And United Nations, as far as I'm aware, has not made a formal response. And you also said, well, I'm getting most of all, I'm getting silence. So, and now in this example of Julian Assange in the embassy of Ecuadorian embassy in London, again, United Nations makes some statements, and that's pretty much it. And they're ignored, and there is a hidden warrant for his arrest in the United States. That's established, and that's the reason he dare not leave that embassy. So what's the legitimacy or the function of United Nations in this time then?
Well, as you know, the United Nations is not Antonio Guterres, is not the Secretary General. The United Nations is 193 states, and each state has its own geopolitical interests. Each state has its axe to grind. So it's difficult to get everybody on board if you're trying to do something for somebody like Assange. Now, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has on more than one occasion called upon the United Kingdom to implement its recommendations in the judgment dating 2016. It's already 3 years old. And the man has had to suffer 3 additional years. By the way, I visited Assange in the embassy in London, spent 3 hours with him, very impressed intellect and by his enormous knowledge of the situation and the implications and the complications, etc. But of course, he has angered the hegemon. He has angered the United States. And the United States will not hesitate to use every blackmail and every arm twisting in order to silence this man, in order to neutralize this man. It's like with Edward Snowden, the other major whistleblower who let us know that our right to privacy is gone. Let us know that the United States government, contrary to the United States Constitution, in violation of United States law, has been snooping on all of us for years on end, and that we taxpayers, I said at the beginning that I'm a Swiss citizen, but I'm also a United States citizen. I pay taxes in the United States. I mean, my tax dollars are being used to finance the National Security Agency, which is basically a criminal organization. It's basically an organization that is breaking the law, breaking your rights and my rights and the rights of millions of American citizens. So it is surrealistic how governments, or rather the deep state, does what it wants, notwithstanding what civil society says, what non-governmental organizations say, what the United Nations say. This is just the old recipe. Might is right. And Trump is certainly a principal practitioner.
Well, let's move to Trump then for a bit, because most people start to feel that something's off. Or maybe they didn't feel it during the Iraq crisis and war, but they certainly feel it now. And Trump has used that momentum and got into office, basically by good marketing, but also by making the point, we're not going to intervene anymore. We're going to focus on America.
He's betrayed his own program, the same as Lenin Moreno has betrayed his. Yeah. He's abandoned this, shall we say, attractive aspect of his non-interventionist stance at the time of the campaign. He referred to Iraq and the American adventure in Iraq as a disaster. He referred to Libya as a disaster, but he wants to create another Libya in Venezuela. And then what is, shall we say, obscene is to invoke human rights, to destroy human rights, to invoke the rule of law, to destroy the rule of law. And now Pompeo comes out with his myth of Hezbollah in Venezuela to say, well, that gives us, we have to protect the American people. That is an immediate danger to the American people. So we have to go in there and mop them up.
Now, when Obama got into office, I had faith in that man, and he won a Nobel Peace Prize. But he will go down in history also. Hang on. He will go down in history also as the president of the drone wars, right? So the change.
I voted for him.
Huh?
I voted for Obama. You can imagine how unhappy I am with the result of my vote.
Would you have voted differently now then, at this time?
Well, the second time around, I didn't vote at all. I voted for him 2008. Mm-hmm. 2012, I was so disgusted that I didn't vote at all. And now in 2016, I was not going to vote Clinton. I was not going to vote Trump. So you can, in the American ballot, you can write in your candidate. Yeah. So I wrote Bernie Sanders. Not that Bernie Sanders is the best candidate in the world. On the other hand, during the campaign, he actually had a very decent, moderate, humanistic campaign. And I said, at least I can throw my vote away, but at least put in a name as a protest vote.
Well, Bernie Sanders ended up supporting Clinton. What's your take on that then?
No, well, I was very disappointed. I would never have done it, but politicians do things that they themselves regret.
You think Sanders has regrets doing that?
I'm sure in his heart of hearts he does, except that the world of politics is a surrealistic world, and you have several narratives. And but again, I am convinced that Bernie Sanders would not have gotten the United States involved in the Venezuelan internal affairs. I'm sure that Bernie Sanders would not have insisted on blockading the Venezuelan economy.
But then you're making the point that Sanders had more integrity running for president than Obama had in his day and that Trump had in his campaign.
Correct. That's why I thought if anybody put his name down, because he is among the candidates probably the best. Actually, the only president whom I yearn for and I admire is Jimmy Carter. And when I saw Jimmy Carter back in 2015, before the elections, I told him in jest, now, Jimmy, why don't you run for office again? You'll be elected. That was in 2015. And at least he's someone who has a moral compass. He's someone who is committed to human rights, someone who in the years after his presidency has done so much more for the world than he did while he was president, that I have grown to admire him. But the Latins used to say, nil admirare, don't admire anybody, because people are likely to disappoint you. Now, there are exceptions.
But what was Carter's response?
Well, he laughed.
Yeah, obviously.
Good man. At the time I saw him, he was 89. Now I think he's 93. I don't know exactly how old he is right now. What's your 93? Yeah.
Yeah, that's not going to work. What's your take on Tulsi Gabbard then?
A lot of fun. I mean, I'm looking forward to hearing much more from her. Actually, there are some very good candidates among the Democrats who are throwing their hat on the arena. And certainly also, although the whole, for me, that is a sideshow. The whole issue of her indigenous heritage, Elizabeth Warren. Now, Elizabeth Warren is a very gifted woman. She's also a graduate of Harvard Law School, like I am. She has a distinguished record as a senator. She is very experienced, and I'm sure she can do a magnificent job as president. But of course, people do make mistakes, and people, shall we say, embellish their histories in order to advance, and then you grow to regret it when they bring it out and throw it at you.
Yeah, first thing Trump did when he heard she was running. Oh, you're going to use that again in your campaign or not?
No, sure. And he'll continue using it. She's not going to be able to undo that.
All right.
And thank God, when this whole business came out, I started looking at my yearbooks, at my college yearbooks and law school yearbooks, and say, gosh, did I say anything untoward in those yearbooks? Thank God there's nothing in there, except that at the time I was an active member of the Republican Club at Harvard University. And but again, it only mentions me as a member. It doesn't reflect the fact that I was actually very active.
You have any political ambitions yourself or no?
Oh, heavens no. Actually, my ambitions are literary. I was for 7 years the president of the pen club, pen poets, essayists, novelists here in Switzerland. And I have translated a lot of Rilke. I have a very successful book of Rilke translations. I translated Rilke into English, into French, into Spanish. And I am now finishing 220 translations of Hermann Hesse's Das Lied des Lebens. That is a collection of poems. I find them fantastic. And Hesse is known, of course, as a novelist of Steppenwolf and Demian and Glasperlenspiel, but he's not known as a poet. And I find that his poetry is exquisite, reminds me a lot of Rilke. And I must say, when I'm translating, it's like therapy. I forget all the woes of the world. I forget all the nonsense that's going on around me. And for 2 or 3 hours, I am in Rilke's world or in Hesse's world, and I feel happy, satisfied, happy, contented.
Yeah. Thing is, okay, well, you made the right choice. I tried politics for like 2 years. Now I'm a guitarist, same deal. So good for you.
Music.
Yeah, exactly. Stay away from politics. I agree. So, but let's get back to the story we're telling here about Venezuela, and I want to talk to you about Catalonia as well for a little bit. So you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation the Netherlands, and the Netherlands with some other European Union countries voicing their support for the United States standpoint in supporting Guaido. So why?
How can you support a demented president? I mean, everybody agrees that Trump is a disaster and he has done awful things. But now, remember, when he bombed Syria without any proof whatever that Assad had anything to do with chemical weapons, people started calling him presidential. He commits a major violation of international law, and politicians and the mainstream media suddenly applaud and consider that this war crime that the man has committed makes him presidential.
Yeah, but hang on. What's happening in Venezuela and with European Union and United States is bigger and different than from one President Trump, because we've just established that all these presidents, apart from Carter maybe, did the same atrocities. Now, the thing is, here we have Guaido trying to get into power, and you call it a coup d'etat, and maybe a slow one or a soft one at the moment. European Union is supporting that. Why?
Well, not officially. members of the European Union.
Okay.
We don't have an official recognition by the European Union. And matter of fact, for a country under the rule of law like the Netherlands, to recognize a pretender, to get itself involved in the internal affairs of another state, because certainly the leadership of a country, it's something that belongs exclusively to the citizens of that country. So electing a president in Venezuela is not for the Americans or for the Dutch or for the Germans to influence in any way. Let the Venezuelans decide. And what is very undemocratic is not only that someone would auto-proclaim himself to be interim president. He has no democratic legitimacy, obviously. But for a political party that knows that is not going to be elected to say, I'm going to boycott the elections, that is undemocratic. I mean, if you believe in the essence of democracy, and there are some countries that actually oblige you to vote, then you have to present your candidates and you have to participate in this democratic exercise. Surprisingly enough, although there was such a boycott by the MUD, by the Mesa de Unidad Democrática, and by Voluntad Popular and some of the other opposition leaders, there were still two major opposition candidates, as I said, Henri Falcón and Bertucci, who garnered 32% of the vote. So you have 68% voting Maduro, 32% voting for an opposition. Of course, it's not Leopoldo López. Of course, it's not Ledesma. Of course, it's not Capriles. Of course, it's not Julio Borges. But in any event, there were opposition leaders. You don't believe in the legitimacy of the election. Well, it's your own fault. I mean, if you don't participate, you cannot say, I'm going to boycott, and then afterwards I'm going to call it undemocratic. It's you yourself who have shot yourself in the foot. But again, that doesn't make any difference in a world of fake news and in a world of manipulation of public opinion, because the mainstream media has repeated that Maduro is illegitimate. And by now, I would say a lot of people outside do not recognize Maduro, and they just simply repeat, they echo what they have heard in CNN, that Maduro is illegitimate.
So what is the I'm asking you, maybe that you can't answer it, but you can hypothesize with me. Why is my government, my Prime Minister Rutte, taking a position with his cabinet to support the position of the United States? Is he just watching CNN, or is there something else going on in your opinion?
There must be something else going on, because I do not understand what's going on. Rutte should never have recognized Guaido. If anything, he should have said he believes in the usefulness of elections, that another election could be conducted. There again, it's up to the Venezuelans to decide that, whether they want to have another presidential election. Maduro has already said that he is willing to have a new parliamentary election, which, of course, the opposition has rejected. But I don't see any major problem in holding a new presidential election, which, by the way, Maduro could win.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Keep that in mind. If there's no boycott, it could actually end up winning it.
We've been talking for close to an hour now, and I need to talk to you about another election as well. And this is the one in Spain and in Catalonia, because the question that I have for you is where does the right to self-determination and the right to secession in human rights law come from in that situation in Catalonia? They had a vote right? And they've been denied the right to continue, and now people are in jail facing a trial for rebellion. So, how should they
the law is
proceed?
very clear. Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights states that all peoples have the right to self-determination, which of course can be internal or external self-determination. You can have the model of federalism and the model of autonomy. It doesn't have to be secession, but they do have the right to secession if they want it. And then Article 1, Paragraph 3 says that every state party to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is obliged to promote the right of self-determination. Meaning, it's not just that they shouldn't obstruct it, they actually proactively have to give it content by facilitating, for instance, a referendum and calling on international observers for the referendum, calling the United Nations for advisory services and technical assistance. So there is an obligation in international law to recognize the right of self-determination, which has been practiced. When the Soviet Union collapsed, you had 15 new state entities emerging, each one of them exercising self-determination. You had, with the dissolution of the socialist federal state of Yugoslavia, you had 7 new entities emerging. You had the Slovenians. The Slovenians basically, a small country, very small, as a matter of fact, they functioned rather well within the Yugoslav federal state. And they suddenly decided, well, we want to have our own thing. We have our language, our culture, our history, etc. And we'd rather be alone. And no sooner did they unilaterally declare their independence that Germany and the other European states immediately recognized it. So that created a precedent. Then you had Croatia doing the same thing. That, of course, led to a war, and a rather costly war. Then you had Bosnia and Herzegovina declaring itself independent, and that led to another war. But in the end, you had the emergence of a number of states whose raison d'etre is the right of self-determination. Now, if it is granted to the Slovenians, who are far less numerous than the Catalans, why should it not be granted to the Catalans, who have their own language, their own culture, their own traditions, their own identity? What I say is, none of my business whether Catalonia becomes an independent state. That is for the Catalans to decide. The same thing as I said for Venezuela. Only the Venezuelans have a right to decide their future. The Catalans have a right to decide their future through a referendum, properly organized, properly monitored. And instead of obeying its international obligations under Article 1 of the Covenant, Spain has actually violated Article 1 of the Covenant and criminalized the exercise of the right to decide, criminalized the exercise of peaceful demonstrations. I think the Catalans have been exemplary in their quest for independence through years of consistent, peaceful demonstrations and peaceful argumentation. So if anybody has a right or has won the right to independence, certainly the Catalans, because of their persistence and because of their commitment to democratic principles and their commitment to peaceful methods. But once again, might makes right. And Madrid doesn't want to hear about Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and Brussels looks away. Brussels gets involved in minor violations of the Lisbon Treaty in Hungary and in Poland, and lets the major violations in Catalonia go. In particular, what is most offensive, the violations committed on the 1st of October 2017, where multiple articles of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights were violated. Not only, as I said, not only the right to freedom of expression and freedom of manifestation, but also here you had violence. Here you had violations of Article 7, which is torture and cruel or inhuman treatment. Then you have violations of Article 9 with arbitrary detention of politicians who are democratically elected politicians who are doing something protected under international law. And international law, as you know, in the Spanish legal order, the Constitution provides in Article 10, paragraph 2, and Article 96, that international law is superior to national law, and that national law has to be understood in the light of human rights principles. They specifically mention, for instance, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 10, paragraph 2.
Hang on. Now, so there's two major things going on in Catalonia or in Madrid right now. One is the trial against the political prisoners. Yes, that's one part. The other part is the long-term future, if you will, for Catalonia. Now, what are the international tools or juridical means that Catalonia can use as a follow-up to that referendum on October 1st, 2017?
Well, I think that this is a matter not only for the European Court of Human Rights, because there have been major violations of the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, but it's a matter for the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg for violations of European law, for violations of principles of democracy and rule of law by Spain. And this is something that at very least has to be investigated. And then I think that there is enough gravity in the violations to start an Article 7 procedure under the Treaty of Lisbon. But that is not advancing because, as I said earlier, international law is being applied arbitrarily. It's not being applied uniformly. We have double standards. And it is a great, shall we say, shock. It's a great disappointment to see that an organ that should have, shall we say, a degree of neutrality and objectivity and methodology, actually it's losing its credibility precisely because of the arbitrary fashion in which it acts. So there's a great deal of politicization in Brussels, and it seems that the only thing that matters are economic interests, and those are the forces that drive decisions of the European Commission.
You claim economic interests, or rather, if I would interpret that, the avoidance of major economic problems emerging.
Exactly. So that's one thing. The other thing is the fear that several members of the European Union have that the precedent set by the independence of Catalonia would mean that the Corsicans would then be able to split from France. And I think they should have the right to leave France if they want to.
Yeah, so if there's a
classical case of exercise of self-determination, provided that there is a proper referendum, properly monitored, etc. Then you have the Austrian Germans of southern Tyrol. I mean, this is a province in northern Italy now called Alto Adige that was just given to Orlando at the Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919 for his help in defeating the Austrians and the Germans.
You're a living encyclopedia.
I mean, imagine what that means. You decide over the fate of 200,000 Austrians and say, just give them to the Italians. Yeah. They'll be happy in Italy. Well, no, they're not happy, and they wanted to remain part of their people, part of Austria, and then they were taken out. So now, if you have the president of Catalonia, it would apply in South Tyrol. It would apply to Veneto. Yeah. It certainly applies in Trieste. And they prefer not to rock the boat too much.
Yeah, so they have some rocking coming on. But the Catalans are not quitting. And in wrapping up this conversation, we've talked over an hour already, there is precedent also that's with hope. If you look at the referendum in Scotland and in Quebec twice. So if you just listen to the people and you give them the vote and you take them seriously, then secession needs not be the end result. You know?
Exactly.
So thanks so much for being here, and we might talk again somewhere in the future. This has been very interesting. Yeah, typically my guest would blow out the candle, but yeah, I have to help you there.
Okay.
Any last remarks, Mr. Alfred de Zayas?
No. Tot ziens.
Tot ziens. Thank you so much.